Okay, welcome AP World History students. Remember, we're unfortunately a chapter off here, so try not to get confused. This is actually chapter 25 in the 4th edition of Bentley's book, but the title is the same, and that's important, and that is New Worlds, the Americas and Oceania. We'll start off with Spanish Caribbean. Remember, this kind of picks up where Columbus left off. Remember that he lands in the Caribbean, in an area that becomes known as Hispaniola, and that originally the Indians that he meet are going to be the Taino Indians. He's very disappointed that the Taino, they have no spices or silks because, again, he thinks that he has made it to India or at least Japan. The Native Americans don't have any of that stuff. Instead, he basically recruits locals to help mine gold. Remember, God, glory, and gold. And he thinks that he's going to at least get gold, at the very least. What will eventually work out, unfortunately for the Native Americans, is a system that you must know called encomienda, which is the forced labor of the Indians basically on these plantations. The Taino did occasionally rebel, but there's really not a whole lot that they can do against the superior Spanish weaponry. And also, of course, they are just decimated by smallpox epidemics. The Spaniards end up launching raids that end up kidnapping and replacing Indian workers. And each time that they go in and raid a new place, it's only spreading diseases further. Not only smallpox, but measles as well. Taino society actually disappears by the middle of the 16th century. It's quite the travesty. And there's really just not very much gold in the Caribbean, in this region. Now, it does cause new interest in exploiting Caribbean for something different than gold, and that's sugar. And sugar will be incredibly profitable, the most profitable of all the cash crops. Unfortunately, this is going to lead us down the road to African slavery and, the terrible system that develops there. So they got to import slaves because Native Americans don't make very good slaves. They easily, and they're dying from smallpox. So they just don't make good labor. Africans are going to fill that void, unfortunately for them. Now, conquest of Mexico and Peru by a couple of conquistadors, guys that are pretty easy to remember, and we've kind of mentioned them before. Hernando Cortez, of course, is very famous. He comes into and conquers the mighty, powerful Aztec Empire. He does it with less than 500 men. Of course, he has guns, he has horses, he has cannon. But even then, he's thrown back by the Aztec warriors originally. They had some 30,000 battle-hardened warriors, and they threw him back the first time. However, he left them a present in the way of disease, and the next time that he shows up, their forces have been decimated, and he is able to come in and capture Tenochtitlan. A cousin of his, actually, Francisco Pizarro, would actually land down in Peru and would bring down the Inca Empire. He is as bad as they come as far as people go, Pizarro is. He ends up calling a conference of the warring Inca rulers who are fighting sort of a civil war amongst themselves, and he kills a bunch of them. And of course, you know that he took the Inca ruler Atahualpa. He kidnapped him, held him for ransom for a room of gold and 2 rooms of silver on the promise that he would return him if he got this ransom. The Inca took a while. While they were gathering all of this gold and silver, they had Atahualpa convert to Christianity. When they got the silver, they strangled him, and they considered it a blessing. So yes, go Spanish there. The Spanish administration becomes based in what becomes known as New Spain, which is actually today's Mexico, and New Castile, which is there in Peru, in South America. Mexico City was built on top of Tenochtitlan, this incredible large city that was, there on the island of Lake Texcoco. You had a position called viceroys who ruled these regions, but they were supervised by local courts called audiencias, which were designed to prevent a buildup of local power bases. What you don't want is people starting their own, country or their own thing away from Spain. Spain wants control over these colonies. There's considerable dispute with the Spanish homeland. Think of it as English colonies in America, getting tired of England after a while. Eventually, of course, that the Portuguese are left because of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Remember, that divides the New World between Spain and Portugal. but they don't know how big the New World is. And so Portugal gets the short end of the stick and essentially just gets Brazil. Not a whole lot at first, but they do use Brazil for sugar, so it is important in its manufacturing of sugar. Now, North America is going to get settled by the Spanish first. They're moving up through Mexico, through New Spain, into modern-day Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. They found Spanish towns and forts and missions all the way out into California. They were dislodged by the 17th century by the French, English, and Dutch, who I've told you they are jealous. They want what Spain and Portugal have in the New World, and they're coming for it. They're not worried about any Treaty of Tordesillas. That doesn't bother them in the least. They're going to found permanent colonies. Remember that France, they come into Canada. Their first colonies were Nova Scotia and Quebec, and that the English will land first 1607 in Jamestown in Virginia, and then a little bit later in Massachusetts Bay in 1630 with the Puritans. And the Dutch will have only one small colony called New Amsterdam, and that'll happen in 1623. It is eventually taken over by the English with the Duke of York, who renames it New York. The Dutch, their problem was that they were too nice, religiously tolerant. They didn't care if you were English. And eventually the English colonies surround New Amsterdam. And so they there's too many English in the Dutch colony, and they want to be an English colony. And so basically the Duke of York takes it over without a fight. Okay, so colonial government, very difficult conditions. There's starvation, there's cannibalism occasionally practiced. It's tough. You're coming to a new world and trying to survive. It is not just merely getting on a boat and taking a 3-month voyage over to the new world and it being successful. It's just not that easy. For Jamestown, the first English colony, they mostly starve. Of the first 500 people that go, only 32 survive. I mean, the colony was almost a bust until they learned about tobacco, and tobacco makes it profitable. So, this was tough, these colonies. The French and English use private merchants. Joint stock companies are basically spending money as an investment opportunity in these new lands. There are greater levels of self-government in these English and French territories than there was in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Those were more royal colonies that had the kings and queens looking over them very closely. Whereas the King of England or the Queen of England didn't really care as long as they were getting, something out of the new world. As you can see, here's a map of European empires and colonies in the Americas around the year 1700. Large blue track here is France. Here is the large territories of Spain. You can see the enormous land holdings that they have. The English don't have nearly as much. They're just on the colonies. It's not going to stay that way. They will eventually, as you know, take all of this. And the Portuguese get Brazil right here. Relations were a little bit different depending on what European colonist group we're talking about, but obviously it wasn't good really for any of the Indians. The North American peoples, the Indians, were loosely organized. Many of them were migratory. You had no great civilized empires like the Aztec and the Inca, not North America. They were Pueblo Indians. They were Mohawk. They were, hundreds of different types of Indians. The European colonists staked out forested land and they cleared it for agriculture. That hurt Indians because they used the forest for their hunting grounds and their hunting lands. And so this is going to bring Indians into conflict with these colonies, these European colonists. An increasing number of Europeans arrived seeking all this new land, this new opportunity. They don't consider that it's Indian land. It is merely land for the claiming, for white men. 150,000 colonists come from England in the 17th century. And English colonies tend to come in families for the most part, especially as the years go by, whereas the French tend to come as single men. The French colonies aren't nearly as populous as the English colonies are. Spanish people tended to come over as single men too, but as you'll see, they marry into Indian society. The English did not do that. It was very rare for an English person to marry an Indian. Pocahontas and John Rolfe are a notable exception. Colonists displaced native peoples. They trespassed on their grounds. They negotiated treaties, and these treaties weren't really understood by the natives because they didn't have a concept of personal private land. The Indians lived in basically a socialistic communal society where everything was shared and nobody really owned anything. It was the people of the tribe that shared it. So they didn't really get what they were signing when they would sign these contracts with whites. There was quite a bit of military conflict. There were several Indian wars, and the Indians are being devastated by disease. And they know that these diseases did not exist until the appearance of white man. So they make the connection. And of course, they're going to rightfully blame white people for the diseases. As you can see, in the 1500s, the native population was enormous, about 8 million. You have almost no Europeans and almost no Africans. By 1800, 300 years later, you can see that less than 1 million natives remain, and the European population has surged, and you see a nice surge of African populations. Obviously, the vast majority will be in the form of slaves. You get multicultural societies because of the mixing. Um, the African and European migrants were mostly men, like I said. However, the English were a little bit different. The Puritans and some of those groups did come over in families. Relationships with Native women were formed, especially in Spanish society. You got the mestizos. Those were people of Spanish, so they were white people from Spain, and Indians. That was a mestizo, probably what you think of as a Mexican today. You also had descendants of Spaniards and African slaves, which were called mulattoes. So they were white and black, they were mixed. And then you had descendants of African slaves and Indians, which were called Zambos. So you had these kind of all these three different little multicultural societies. This wasn't nearly as prevalent in Peru. This was pretty much a Mexico thing. The hierarchy was race based. At the top was a group you need to know called the Peninsulares. They were white people. They came from Spain or they came from Portugal. They're white. They're European. Then you had the Creoles. They're white too, for the most part, but they're the children of the migrants. They're second generation. Then you had the mestizos, the mulattoes, the zambos, and any other combinations of different parentage. At the bottom, you had the slaves or conquered peoples. A defining factor in social standing in this sexual hierarchy. North American societies, there was a higher ratio of French and English female migrants than in South America. So there are more women coming to Canada and to what will become America. There were higher social stigma attached to relationship with natives and African slaves. Like I said, far less mixing amongst these two groups, the French and the English. Fur traders, which was the basis of Canadian trade and French trade there. Fur traders had relationships with native women. Their children were called the Métis. They had a little bit better relationship, the French did, with Indians than the English did. Mining in the Spanish Empire, there's an enormous hunt for gold and silver. You get the quest for El Dorado and Cibola, these cities of gold. The conquistadors stole all the money. They looted the Aztec and Inca treasures, melted down their gold and silver, sent them back to Spain. Gold wasn't extensive, but silver was. There was quite a bit of silver. In fact, so much so that it would cause some inflation back in Spain. Extensive employment of natives. They're going to conscript labor out of the natives. Rough working conditions, but the Spanish and Portuguese do not care whatsoever. Many of these Indians Native Americans will eventually assimilate into Spanish culture. And the crown got something called the fifth, the quinto. And what that was that all these conquistadors over there, they could take whatever they wanted, but the crown gets a fifth of it, like a tax, 20%. This made Philip II a very rich and wealthy man. Now, a major resource of income for the Spanish crown, without a doubt, it helps make them powerful. You have these Spanish galleons, these Spanish ships that are taking it to the Pacific Rim for trading, and the Chinese like it. They may not like stuff that come from Europe, but they do like gold and they do like silver, and that is coming from the New World in large quantities. You get something called the hacienda. I think of the haciendas sort of like the Roman latifundias. They're these plantations, essentially, large estates that produce products of European origin, wheat, grapes, meat. And you get kind of with that, you get the encomienda system, which basically uses native labor as slave labor. Incredibly bad abuses, rapings and murders and and beat downs. It's really, really bad. Gradually replaced by something called debt peonage, basically where peasants can repay their loans with their cheap labor. A little better system. Encomienda system was the Spanish missionaries saw it and begged the Spanish crown basically to help the Indians because it was so bad. Here's a little drawing of a hacienda. As you can see, it's a large estate, and then you have the fields that are going to make its money, make its profit. There is some resistance to Spanish rule, as you can imagine. There were a couple rebellions. The Pueblo Revolt happened out in New Mexico in 1680. It was successful for about 10 years, and then the Spanish come back and take care of business. You had the Tupac Amora Rebellion as well. The Indians, one of kind of like Africans will do after them. One of the few things they can do is not work very hard. That's a way to resist. And when they could, they would retreat into the mountains and forests and try to hide basically from the Spanish. But eventually, you get a Spanish missionary like Felipe Guanam Palma de Aya, who writes a 1,200-page letter in 1615 decrying the conditions of the Native American peoples. And we'll look at some of the documents and stuff. It's horrendous how they're treated. So remember, sugar. Sugar mills, these engenhos down in Brazil. Everything's related to production of sugar. Sugar is incredibly wealthy, and they're going to end up importing African slaves in enormous numbers, and that these slaves have the worst working conditions of any slaves in America. About 5 to 10% die every year, and approximately 1 human life per ton of sugar is what it works out to be. So, a human life, basically they put a human life worth a ton of sugar in this time period. It was terrible. Fur trading is the big deal in North America, and the native peoples would trade pelts for wool blankets and iron pots and firearms, even alcohol. And alcohol has some really negative consequences on Indians. Many of the Indians really take to alcohol, and it ruins their society. The French will trade, and the Dutch will trade Indians firearms. The English do not. They do not put guns in the hands of Indians, but the Indians are getting their hands on them from the French and the Dutch anyway. Beaver hunts caused frequent incursions into territory that didn't belong to the French. So you got the Beaver Wars. You got Indians against Indians, Iroquois against the Hurons. One of the Indians' biggest problem was that they couldn't really unite with each other. They didn't see each other as the same. They saw each other as Iroquois, as the Hurons, that there's something different. European settler cultivators also displaced natives from traditional lands. Again, they're farmers. The English are coming over and they're clearing land. They're cutting down trees to farm. And the Indians weren't farmers, not in the beginning. In the beginning, it's crazy, but the Europeans relied on Indians to basically survive because they didn't know how to work the land over here. And so the Indians kind of seal their own doom by being nice in the beginning to the Europeans. Cash crops is the big development over here, and it's going to shape the history of the Americas from basically 500 until, we'll say, the end of the Civil War, 1865. And a little bit longer even in Brazil, who doesn't end their slavery until 1888, I think. Products that were developed, major ones, tobacco is probably the first, other than sugar. Tobacco is the first one in North America. Rice, indigo, cotton all become major cash crops. And of course, that is going to need slave labor. In the beginning in North America, they used indentured servants who would serve 4 to 7 year terms. These were basically people that were in trouble back in England, and they owed money, or they were, like it says, political prisoners. They didn't have jobs, so they could come over, sign a 4 to 7 year contract, and when they were done, they would get granted several acres of land and they could start a life. But it was tough being an indentured servant. Here you can see how much exportation of tobacco from Virginia, and it makes Virginia a wealthy place, and it plays a large part in American history, which hopefully we'll talk to you guys next year in A Push about. African slavery starts in North America, in Virginia, in Jamestown in 1619, and it's going to be around tobacco, brown gold. Uh, Again, that is going to replace indentured servants. That well dries up, and Africans are going to fill the void there. Not nearly as many slaves in the northern areas, like the northern colonies, the northern English colonies. There's not really land for cash crops there. Slave trading is still an important part of the economy, and there are some products made through slave labor there in the north, just not nearly in the numbers as the South. A lot of missionary activity in Americas. You get Franciscan and Dominicans and Jesuit missionaries. So you're getting Catholics, you're getting well, those are all Catholics, but different branches of Catholic missionaries. Jesuits being the most successful for sure. They're teaching Native Americans Christian doctrine, literacy, how to read in English, obviously, or in Spanish or French, whatever the vernacular was. And, like the Jesuits were really good because they would actually learn like Indian languages, and they would, take on cultural knowledge of the natives so that they could better communicate their message. And so they were able to convert more Indians to Christianity. Due to conquest and plague, however, many natives in Spanish America concluded that the gods had abandoned them. And so they end up converting to Catholicism because, they've lost faith in their own gods. Again, their Christianity is typically a little bit different than what the Spanish and French are trying to bring at them, though. Okay. Oh, sorry. I thought that was the end. Here's the Virgin of Guadalupe, basically a saint of her time. French and English missions, less effective than Spanish missions, less brutal. The Spaniards are ruling native populations more directly, as you can see. And the migration patterns of North American natives made it difficult to conduct missions. Especially a lot of your Indians in North America migrated, moved around a lot. And they weren't settled in places like the Aztecs, like the Inca. And the English colonists, they didn't have nearly as much interest in converting natives. They definitely saw them as something subhuman. Australia, basically, there are Portuguese sailors in the area. The Dutch are the first ones who first Europeans that see Australia, but the Dutch East India Company, they survey the area. They don't think it's very valuable. Australia is a tough place, mostly made up of desert. The indigenous peoples there are the Aborigines, and so they just didn't find it valuable. A little bit later on, though, the British captain James Cook lands at Botany Bay, as you can see quite a bit later, 1770. And what England ends up doing is they decide that their jails are full, and so Australia will make the perfect place to be a prison. And they ship so Australian history is based off of being prisoners, and they would ship their prisoners to Australia, and they eventually outnumber the free settlers there. And here's a picture of an Australian Aborigine, and this group of people still exist over there. You get a lot of explorations of the Pacific Islands by the Portuguese, by the Spanish, the islands of Guam. You get all these small little places out there, and smallpox is doing the same thing out there that it does in mainland North America and South America. James Cook ends up visiting Hawaii, so he gets Australia and he keeps exploring. He finds Hawaii in 1778, about the same time that America is fighting in the Revolutionary War. He has a good relationship with the Hawaiians, but the sailors spread venereal diseases, and Cook was not welcomed later on, and he ends up getting killed in a dispute over petty thefts. All right, and you see some of the voyages here. Okay, that concludes this chapter. An important chapter, easier, I think, to remember. A couple of terms that you need to make sure you know. Okay, thank you, guys.